What makes millions of people obey? Not just with fear, but with faith? What turns individuals into crowds? Neighbors into informants? Families into silence? What turns the human mind into a switch that someone else can flip? To understand that, you have to look at the Soviet Union. Not just the gulags, not just the propaganda, but the experiments. Because in the USSR, obedience wasn't just enforced, it was engineered. Let's talk about ideology as hypnosis. From the moment you were born in Soviet society, you were told a story that the state was mother and father, that the party was always right, that your worth came from your labor, that your voice was dangerous. That truth was relative. And the most dangerous thought of all? That you could think for yourself. Let's talk about Pavlov and the mind. You know Ivan Pavlov is the man with the dogs, the bells, the saliva. But what you may not know is that the Soviet regime weaponized his research. They studied conditioned reflexes, not to heal people, but to reshape them. Pavlov discovered that under stress, the mind becomes pliable, that repeated trauma could erase prior conditioning, that a breakdown could lead to reprogramming. The USSR saw this not as science, but as a tool. Let's talk about the concept of restructuring consciousness. Soviet psychologists were tasked with a project: how to break the self and replace it with loyalty, how to empty a mind and fill it with the party. Their findings? Isolation weakens resistance. Contradictory messaging creates compliance. Surveillance triggers self-censorship. Repetition breeds internalization. And once internalized, the control no longer needed to be enforced. People would police themselves. Let's talk about language erosion. The Soviets created a new dialect. Euphemisms like corrective labor for slavery, enemy of the people for anyone critical, special treatment for torture and death. This wasn't just deception. It was neurological warfare. When you corrupt language, you limit thought. When you destroy nuance, you destroy rebellion. Let's talk about learned helplessness. In many Soviet cities, things didn't work. Food was missing. Phones didn't function. Nothing changed, no matter how loud you screamed. Eventually, you stopped screaming. You lowered your head. You took what was given. You stopped hoping. That was by design. They didn't just want obedience. They wanted you to stop believing in alternatives. Let's pause. You think you'd have resisted. You think you'd have spoken out. But what if obedience wasn't a choice? What if it was the only thought your brain could generate? They called them corrective camps. But they were laboratories, testing grounds, places where the mind could be stripped bare, where identity was not suppressed, but dismantled. Let's talk about the Gulag. The Soviet Gulag system wasn't just about punishment. It was about transformation. A human being enters. An obedient shadow leaves. In the camps, control wasn't only physical, it was psychological. Prisoners were starved, overworked, and isolated. But more than that, they were turned against each other. Let's talk about informants. Every camp had them. Fellow prisoners who reported on others, sometimes to gain food, sometimes out of fear, sometimes because they'd been conditioned. The system didn't just monitor from above. It made you believe everyone around you was watching. So you learned to speak in coded language, never show emotion, never trust kindness, deny your inner voice, because even thought could be betrayal. Let's talk about interrogation. The NKVD and, later, the KGB developed psychological torture techniques designed to break down even the most resistant minds. No sleep, no light, no sense of time, endless questioning, contradictory orders. The goal was not truth. The goal was obedience. Eventually, the subject would confess anything to stop the madness. to please the voice asking the questions, to feel like they had some any control. Let's talk about re-education. In certain prisons, inmates were given a choice: change your mind or be erased. They were flooded with party literature, forced to write self-criticisms, required to denounce their families, to confess to crimes they didn't commit. And when they complied, they were praised, reinforced, fed, recognized. Their minds learned the lesson. Belief is dangerous. Compliance is rewarded. Let's talk about the Pavlovian prison. Yes, there were actual experiments. In one case, a group of political prisoners was placed under a regime of extreme control. Lights were manipulated. Meals were given at random. Familiar sounds were replaced with coded noise. Names were taken away. Numbers assigned. The goal? Total disorientation. After several weeks, the prisoners began forgetting their own stories, accepting new truths, obeying without questioning, not because they believed, but because belief no longer mattered. Let's talk about the self-policing mind. Even after release, many former prisoners lived as if the walls were still there. They whispered in private, feared telephones, avoided eye contact. The camp had moved. Inside them, this is what the regime wanted. Not just silence, but internalized suppression. Let's talk about intergenerational damage. Children of prisoners inherited the silence, the fear, the paranoia. Entire families lived for decades in a kind of psychic exile, and no one could explain why. Because the truth had no language, and the pain had no name. Let's pause. The camps weren't just places of suffering. They were experiments. Meticulous, refined, and their conclusion? Obedience is programmable. You don't need bars to build a prison. You just need repetition, and fear, and a system that rewards silence. In the Soviet Union, obedience wasn't hidden. It was ritualized, made sacred, woven into every detail of life. Let's talk about the schoolroom. Children weren't just educated. They were shaped. From the first day, they learned to praise the party, to revere Lenin as infallible, to report on their parents if necessary, to silence doubt before it could speak. They wrote essays titled, "Why I Love Stalin," drew posters celebrating industrial quotas, memorized slogans instead of ideas, and every question that began with why was quietly erased. Let's talk about pioneers and Komsomol. These were more than youth organizations. They were pipelines. You wore the red scarf. You saluted the flag. You learned to chant, to march, to obey. You were trained to belong and to fear what it meant not to. Refusing to join marked you as suspicious. Already the system had you. Let's talk about the workplace. Jobs weren't just jobs. They were extensions of the state. Each factory had its own party cell. Each meeting began with political declarations. Each worker had a file. Each mistake was noted. Colleagues monitored each other. Criticism sessions were held. You were expected to confess failings, even if you had none, because guilt kept you compliant. And the absence of guilt was considered proof of pride. Let's talk about television and print. All media was state-controlled, but more than censored. It was crafted. The goal wasn't to inform. It was to train emotional response. Every film, every book, every headline taught you what to feel, who to love, who to hate, how to interpret reality. The news didn't reflect the world. It constructed it. And in time, you no longer asked if it was true, only if it was safe to repeat. Let's talk about ritualized speech. In the USSR, certain phrases were expected. Long live the revolution. Glory to the party. Down with imperialism. You said them not because you believed, but because not saying them was dangerous. Language became camouflage. Let's talk about surveillance in the soul. You woke up each day knowing you were being watched, not by cameras, but by people, neighbors, friends, family, even your own children. The KGB received thousands of reports daily, most from ordinary citizens. Why? Because the system taught people to see suspicion, even in kindness. To prove loyalty, you had to betray. And over time, betrayal became instinct. Let's talk about emotional constriction. You learned not to smile too freely, not to cry in public, not to show too much joy, because joy looked suspicious. Too much grief? Also suspicious. Neutrality became survival. Emotion was replaced with ritual. Authenticity with choreography. Let's pause. The Soviet system didn't just demand obedience, it embedded it. Into schoolbooks, into holidays, into lullabies, into the muscles of your face, so that even when the state wasn't watching, you watched yourself. And that's the most effective control of all, when you don't need to be forced, because you've already agreed. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The statues fell. The anthem changed. Borders reopened. The world said, "It's over." But it wasn't. Because systems collapse faster than psyches. Regimes vanish long before their echoes do. And the obedience? The fear? The silence? They lived on. Let's talk about the aftermath that didn't feel like freedom. When the USSR dissolved, millions were suddenly free. Free to speak, to travel, to ask questions. But they didn't. Because freedom isn't just legal, it's psychological. And when you've been trained for decades to obey, to watch your words, to distrust your thoughts, to erase your real self, freedom feels dangerous. Let's talk about learned silence. People still whispered, still avoided certain topics, still refused to write things down, still looked over their shoulders when they spoke. They weren't paranoid. They were conditioned. Because trauma doesn't end when the abuser leaves. It stays. It grows roots. Let's talk about the children of the obedient. The next generation inherited the habits, even if they never lived under Stalin. They learned not to ask, why? Not to speak too soon. Not to trust easily. Their parents didn't teach them this on purpose. They modeled it. In body language. In tone. In the way they tensed when someone knocked on the door. Obedience became invisible tradition. Let's talk about nostalgia as control. In the years that followed, many older citizens began to say, at least back then there was order. Everyone had a job. It wasn't perfect, but we weren't lost. This wasn't historical analysis. It was psychological survival. Because when your identity was built on obedience, it's easier to mourn the dictator than to face the void where yourself used to be. Let's talk about the modern replication. Russia today is not the USSR, but echoes remain. Surveillance is digital now. Propaganda is subtler. Obedience is gamified. National identity is weaponized. Dissent is rebranded as disloyalty. And the lessons of the past? They weren't discarded. They were refined. Let's talk about why this matters to you. You didn't grow up in the Soviet Union, but systems of obedience exist everywhere. In schools that punish creativity. In media that sells outrage. In corporations that demand culture fit. In families that equate questions with disrespect. The form changes. The principles don't. Conditioning. Reward. Fear. Conformity. The same script. Different stage. Let's talk about the experiment that never ended. The USSR didn't just test political obedience. It tested what it means to be human. How easily we fracture under pressure. How quickly we trade truth for safety. How deeply we betray to survive. How long obedience echoes through generations? And the answer? Terrifyingly easy. Let's close with this. Obedience isn't always imposed. Sometimes it's chosen, because the cost of rebellion feels too high. But somewhere deep inside, there's a flicker, a question, a memory, a refusal. And that is where freedom begins. Not when the system falls, but when the mind dares to rise.